Shabbat Shalom. On July 15th of this year, I read an article in the Chicago Tribune that sort of blew my mind. Someone had written their autobiography, and in so doing, wrote my biography. It was written by Ralph Raybuck of Northbrook. I was just taken aback. I called him a week later and we met for lunch. He was born the same year as I in the neighboring town of Kota and just about 40 miles away from where I was born, and his experiences were nearly identical to mine. Ralph followed me from Germany to Chicago and lived in Hyde Park community near us. We never met, even though we had some of the same acquaintances and graduated from the same high school. He now serves as a docent at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, and he has his German toy train on display. I put mine on display right outside the door here. If you take a moment to see. My story begins with the marriage of my parents on February 17, 1933, 1 month after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. A couple of weeks after my parents married, the Reichstag Parliament building in Berlin was torched by a communist, and Hitler requested and received the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspending most civil liberties. Hitler opened Dachau concentration camp outside Munich the next month, on March 22nd of 1933, in order to rid himself of political opposition. When the popular President Paul von Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler combined the office of President and Chancellor and effectively became the dictator of Germany. I was born that year under what I call a dark cloud, ringed by not the silver lining, but by Mazel. On January 19, 1934, in Gera, Thüringen, Germany, which is about 60 miles south of Leipzig, my father had taken over my grandfather's business, which was wholesale horses. Farmers would order a new team for their small acreage, and my father would find a pair that had been trained to work in the field. Our house and attached barn were located across the street from the railroad station. The horses would come in by train, and my dad and workmen would pick them up and lead them over to our stable. I loved being literally among the horses, and one of my first encounters with Mazel was that I never got kicked by one. During World War II, the Allies would bomb the rail station, and a few stray bombs leveled our property. So by the time I got there, many years later, it was gone. Our house was a 2-story building with 2 5-room apartments. My paternal grandparents lived upstairs, and my parents and I downstairs. My grandfather passed away of natural causes in 1937. The Nuremberg laws were anti-Semitic and racial laws formulated by the Nazis. They were enacted by the Reichstag on September 15, 1935, at a special meeting convened during the annual Nuremberg rally of the Nazi Party. The 2 laws were the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which forbade marriages and extramarital intercourse between Jews and Germans, and the employment by Jews of German females under the age of 45 in Jewish households. And the second law, the Reich citizenship law, which declared that only those of German related blood were eligible to be Reich citizens. The remainder were classed as state subjects without citizenship rights. A supplementary decree outlining the definition of who was Jewish was passed on November 14th, and the Reich citizenship law officially came into force on that date. The laws were expanded on November 26th to include Romani people, known at that time as Gypsies, and black people. This supplementary decree defined Romanis as enemies of the race-based state, the same category as Jews. From that point on, Jewish businesses were labeled and Germans were told not to patronize them. A drastic decline and collapse of the Jewish-owned businesses began to occur. My mother had to discharge our maid, Martha, among much tears and non-comprehension. My parents began to realize that they must leave Germany. My father signed up for a special tour for those considering immigration to the U.S. and traveled to New York in February of 1937. He spoke to his wealthy cousin here in Chicago and requested sponsorship and help in obtaining visas. We had a second cousin who had been a lawyer in Germany and was now living in Chicago, helping with the paperwork and getting us the visas. That was double mazel. One of the things my father noted on his tour was that the rooms in the apartments in the United States were too small for our furniture. Upon his return, he hired furniture carpenters to cut down some of the furniture so they would fit into the apartments. As an example, our dining room buffet was cut into 3 pieces, but made to look like it had originally meant to be that way. The business had ground to zero by 1938. My father was forced to sell it to our neighbor who was in the coal business for 1/3 its value. On top of this, immigration law took 90% of all our bank accounts, which were confiscated by the state. Each individual was allowed to take all their personal belongings and furniture, but only 10 marks per person. My father bought some Leica cameras and other goods he hoped to sell in the U.S. I had been enrolled in a nearby preschool. Sometime in early 1938, I was met at the door by the head teacher and told to go home. Jews were no longer permitted to participate. Of course, I had little understanding of why I was being exiled from the school. Our visas arrived in the summer of 1938, and at the insistence of my mother, we booked passage on an American ship, the SS George Washington. My parents did not want the ship to turn back to Europe in case war commenced. Again, mazel. I had some smart parents. As an aside, the SS Washington was stopped by a U-boat a year later and was threatened with being torpedoed. 2 large wooden crates were built to house all our goods for shipment. They were about the size of present-day shipping containers that are seen on container vessels. While they were being filled, 2 Nazis were stationed to observe every item being loaded so that no forbidden merchandise or money would be smuggled out of the country. Having them present every day was nerve-wracking, to say the least. We were unable to obtain a visa for my grandmother, and arrangements were made for her to live in the house. In 1942, she and the remaining Jews of our town were sent to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia, where she died in February of '43. She was 70 years old. In 2001, I went to the camp to say Kaddish. I was able to tour the camp and see the beautiful washrooms whose pipes were never connected. It is where the International Red Cross was allowed to witness the fake creature comforts afforded the prisoners. My parents and I left Germany in mid-September 1938 for Amsterdam, Holland, to visit with my mother's sister and family, which had already escaped earlier that year and were immigrating to Brazil. Upon crossing the Holland-German border, the border guard wanted to confiscate my 10-mark note, saying a 4-year-old did not need the money. My father went toe-to-toe with the Nazi and insisted I was entitled to the money. The guard backed down and we were now in Holland. The ship was scheduled to leave from Hamburg, Germany in a few days. We were able to visit with the family during that time. However, my mother got schwilkies, that's Yiddish for nervous if you don't know, and insisted that my father go and check the tourist agent regarding the ship's sailing. He said, don't worry, don't worry. But with her nudging him all the time, he did, and came running back to the apartment with the news that the ship is not going to Hamburg due to the threat of war. A special train had been engaged to take passengers to the French coast, ferry across the English Channel, and board another train for Southampton, England, the next day. Needless to say, we packed quickly and said our goodbyes. We would not see our relatives for almost 15 years. My cousin gave me his electric train, which is outside in the showcase, which I have cherished ever since. We arrived in Southampton just hours before departure. The SS Washington was a new ship and made the crossing to New York in 5.5 days. We had purchased first-class accommodations as we were legally allowed to pay for the tickets, but not bring any additional money. My mother used to say she boarded the ship as a princess and exited as a pauper. We were unable to tip the staff for lack of funds, and they were really ticked off. The ship arrived in New York the first week of October, 1 month before Kristallnacht, another Muslim event. Gera, where I was born, had 3 synagogues in 1920 and over 500 Jews. One of the synagogues was Orthodox, and another Polish Orthodox, and the third was Reformed, German Reform. Like all stories, there's always got to be 3 synagogues. The third synagogue was built as an attached annex to the existing Hotel Kronprinz. By 1933, the Jewish population had decreased to 378. Because of the proximity of the hotel and the synagogue being built onto it, it was spared the torching of the first 2 synagogues on Kristallnacht for fear that the hotel would burn down. However, the contents of the synagogue were taken outside and burned. We headed for Chicago to join our relatives in Hyde Park and begin our transition to becoming American citizens in a free country. The following year, my maternal grandmother and uncle arrived and came to live with us. We were on our way to assimilating in this great land. A great muzzle crowned those who escaped. It would be more than 2 decades until we graduated to more than 1 bathroom. As the historian Ron Chernow reminded me, when we are young, history is something that happened long ago. When we are old, we realize that we are part of history. I am happy to share this part with you. Mazel tov to all, and Shabbat Shalom.
Any place on there. I looked in.
Yeah, I can get the initials.